I've been called resilient my entire life. I would rather not be taking punches that I have to then recover from and be strong. I would have rather none of that stuff happen to me. Instead, I would have just rather have been allowed to be strong without all of this hardship in front of me.
So welcome to the latest episode of Exploring Emotional Overdraft. And I say this every time, but this time I genuinely am excited, and my team are excited. They've been reminding me to do my prep and get ready for this one. Today I'm joined by Dr Nicole DeKay, who is, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong, a data scientist with a PhD in industrial-organisational psychology, but with a passion for using data and analytics to improve worker conditions. And I really liked when you said, I think it might have been on LinkedIn, wellbeing-centered industrial-organisational psychologist. Wellbeing-centered, what an interesting... Data and wellbeing are not words that often go together. So welcome, Dr. Nicole DeKay. Or can I call you Nicole?
Yeah, please.
Awesome. Welcome. So I've mentioned sort of what your skill is, but do you want to tell us a little bit about your background so people understand what you're all about?
Yeah, a little bit about me. So I graduated into the recession of 2008. So immediately following, I had to find a job as a young person and really tried to find my way. So I started in the mental health services. I actually worked as a counselor for really severely mentally disturbed youth. I was a lockdown facility. It's the only job I've been hit when I went to. So I was like, that was my first job out of college. And I learned a lot about the things that drive childhood trauma. And then I went corporate. I got my master's in industrial organizational psychology. I ended up as an intern at Boeing, where I did a lot of really cool stuff for the group of consultants that serve the C-suite. And so I was able to learn a lot about corporate culture. What does it look like? How do decisions get made at the top? And then my mentor in that group, who had just seen 75% of his team get laid off during the recession, told me to get a hard skill. He was like, and the first thing that goes in times of difficulty, which we're seeing again, is HR. And so those soft skills that are not business critical, if you will, tend to go first. And so that's what I did. I was always really good at, databases and Excel. I taught Excel when I was in 7th grade to high school teachers that I eventually had when I graduated. And so that was how I got into that. And I joined a marketing group and I did market research for an R&D firm. I learned so much about aerospace material that I never thought I would know. Became an expert in carbon fiber recycling at one point, working with that group. And then I launched the used parts program at Boeing. Was my big project. I was the largest new business development program in 2018 at the company. And in the process, I watched for the first time the pretty severe dysfunction in an organization in ways that I'd only studied about. And I was stuck in the middle of it, and I was like, "What's happening to me? I'm not able to perform. I'm not able to function." I had a abusive manager, one of my 6 and 6 months managers, as we were going up to launch a multi-billion-dollar program, was very verbally abusive to me and my team members. And that experience, which the first time that I couldn't perform, and I didn't understand. I mean, I still got the high performance rates, but I was like, I don't feel like I'm at my best. This is not work that I believe even deserves that performance review. And so I got really curious about that. And at that time, it was right around Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score coming in. So this was 2016 at the time, and read that book. And then I tried to find, so that's a book about trauma. Written by a medical doctor who, for anyone who hasn't heard of this book, It's written by a medical doctor, and it's really his like many, many decades of experience working with the different forms of traumatic injury. And that book really spoke to me. And then I tried to find information about those concepts in the workplace. And there was nothing. It didn't exist. And so I did one of the most nepotistic things I've ever done, and I called the head of my program that I had gotten my master's degree from, and I asked him, like, can I come back? I'm having a really hard time at work. Like, I just had this great accomplishment, and I feel awful about it. And I really want to study this. And so that's what I did. I went back. I really immersed myself in the well-being. So well-being to me, absence of negative experience and presence of positive. In the workplace, we tend to really only focus on the presence of positive. And so I brought in the absence of negative. I looked at trauma questionnaires that we have from things like the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. So there's a researcher that pioneered this pretty amazing study that showed that there are certain experiences that can predict health consequences and early death for the majority of people, and they happen in your childhood. It's things like an abusive parent, an alcoholic parent, divorce, being hit, being yelled at, being belittled. And then they've added to it since to include like external factors like bullying at school, and those sorts of things. And so I adapted those questionnaires and turned them into like a workplace questionnaire. And that was what I studied. Fascinating results. I used a PTSD symptoms checklist, and like 25% of my sample, I contextualized it to the workplace. So I took the sentences that like a doctor would use about your life, and I added like at work to the end of it. Or if it was totally inappropriate, I restructured the question. Like there's one question like my family and friends make me feel loved, and I was like, I'm not going to put that about work. That's a weird thing to say. So it was like appreciated or something like that, where I just contextualized it appropriately to the place that we were going at. And 25% of my sample would qualified for PTSD, work related. And so, there's just not there since then. So COVID hit in the middle of my PhD program. And so like since then, there's been this explosion of well-being research that actually focuses on the absence of negative as well as the presence of positive. And I'm glad, because it feels like we really overcorrected to only focus on positive in the workplace. And then, yeah, so since then I've worked I had my first job in HR. I was working at a DE&I consulting firm. And in the background, I've always been wanting to launch my own business that relates to like the democratization of the employee experience, because often the information that we have about well-being in the workplace is hidden. It's in an employee survey that you only get to see your manager's results. You can't see what the rest of the company is looking like. You don't know if there's these endemic issues when we talk about things that relate to race, gender, um, disability status, military status. In the United States, those are we call them protected classes. They're the parts of you that are protected by our government. And so you can't look at those and see like what's going on in the company as it relates to who I am and the other people like me. And is there discrimination going on here? And so that's a little bit about me. That was a bit of an intro, but that's how I got here. That's how I got into well-being. When I was working in Boeing, I was like, I also am very proficient at SQL, and I know how to design databases. That was what I did primarily when I was working in used parts, developing algorithms for pricing, like those sorts of things. So I was like, I've been heavy on the business side, but where my passion really lies is in the people. Um, and those are really rare to find together, which I think is why we have such a hard time fighting for people's rights, because the data is fluffy and it's hard to get a hold of, and people don't understand it. So that's my passion, and that's how I got here.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and what a great story. Thank you. And I think you're right. Whilst you were talking, so many things are going through my head. One was I'm currently reading Co-Intelligence by, I forget the author's name, but it's about the definitive book about AI. And he's talking about how it's going to democratize the workplace, because it's not a top-down old school organizational structural model that's going to make AI work. So it's really interesting stuff going on there as well. I think perhaps that might help this. I think probably help drive this, or fragment the workplace, or who knows. But certainly that's interesting, I think. And just to say, so that the reason why this interests me so much, and hopefully interests everyone listening, is because in the presence of a PhD, I feel massively inadequate. But I've written the 50,000 words; it's out there, and people like it, so I can live with it. But an emotional overdraft, as I define it, is when we subsidize the success of our business at the cost of our own mental or physical well-being. And so they intersect. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a counselor. I don't look back at why people are the way they are. I've merely observed as a business advisor what I see happening. And I see this thing I call an emotional overdraft. And it's this constant subsidy or subsidizing of success. And I've written about business, but it could be, I think it's pretty universally in terms of, it could be in your social life or your community life as well. So that's why this seems to fit so well to me. So that's why I was so excited to have Nicole on. I just want to explore that idea of the rarity or the scarcity of people that understand data and SQL and teaching Excel when you're in 7th grade, and your interest in people. Because I've run analytics teams, I've hired lots of analysts, and it is a rare combination, and you end up with what used to be called, I remember in my old company, the chess club. That they were brilliant, and I loved spending time with them, but they couldn't communicate. They got very frustrated in our business because we were a creative business, and they kind of wanted people to see, but couldn't find the words for it sometimes. And I think our skill was to allow them time and space to do that. So why is it so rare, and what do you think its scarcity means for the workplace generally?
Yeah. And this is the most capitalistic answer I hope I give this whole time, but HR analysts are underpaid. So I think that's one of the biggest drivers in what I see, is that the people who are really good at analytics, one, when they move into HR, they're usually doing it for passion. They're doing it because they believe in helping people. But then when they get there, there's a big difference between marketing and sales, where I spent most of my career, and the data that I had access to, the data architects that I had access to, who taught me how to develop and design, beautiful artifacts that you can use to create your really fast market assessments. All of your data is structured perfectly so that you can just quickly do, without advanced SQL, the really fast things that you need to do to create a pricing algorithm, for example. Not that that was simple. That was like 10,000 lines of code, but it was, it's one of those things where there's a stark difference between both the quality of data that you get when you then go into HR, and then the quality of analysts, because a lot of the ones that are really good will leave because they're so frustrated. And I've talked to, there are a lot of people that I've come into contact with in the HR analytics realm who run companies that try and help this. And that's something that they lament regularly, is a good analyst will leave HR. They'll go to marketing and sales, where they can get paid better and have access to better information, because it's so frustrating to be in a place where you can get so little done, not because you're not good at your job, but because there aren't the systems in place that would allow you to do it well.
And one of the things I talk about quite often is specifically in relation to emotional overdraft is the almost impossibility to quantify it, because it's a feeling, and until very recently we've gone, well, feelings, but we know that feelings are, the amazing René Loiseau said, feelings are the measure of the quality of our thinking. I thought, what a beautiful definition of that, and it's a keystone I've used so many times, because when I'm getting frustrated or irritated or angry, I can go, hang on, Andy, what's going on? Roll back. But it's not easy to measure. So what are I suppose, is it the fact that we can measure some things more easily, that we value them more, do you think? So financially, did we make a profit or not? What did it cost? What's our churn rate? What's our time to hire? What's our retention rate? There are a few things we can measure, but then we sort of shy away from, you went the soft stuff because it's hard to measure or because we can't measure it.
Because it's hard to measure. There's also a lot of stigma that I think a lot of, especially in the areas that I've been, engineers have a lot of stigma towards psychology. And I post on LinkedIn pretty regularly just to raise awareness of like, what does workplace bullying look like? What does incivility in the workplace look like? What is workplace trauma? Because those concepts and those like very simple basics of what the sort of things that I'm trying to raise awareness about just aren't there. And I had someone post on my thread just saying like, well, psychology isn't a science, so none of this matters. Everything that you found about bullying and all of these results, it doesn't matter because this is a bunk science. And so one of those, there's overcoming that stigma because like I'm in industrial organizational psychology, which is in the STEM sciences. I'm part of the STEMs. Like we use a lot of scientific rigor in our processes. I had to take 3 years of statistics to get my PhD because it's so important in my science that you incorporate those sorts of things so you can show, not prove because you can't prove anything, but show that there's an effect that is a relationship that is occurring and like causal in nature if you can. And so there's pieces of it that even when you get to the point of measuring it, and there's this concept called like postmodernism versus forgetting the early one, but like the truth seeking is the idea behind it. You're seeking out the truth. When it comes to measures about humans, like you can only get like an 80% accurate understanding of the truth because people lie. People have biases. People also have shame about some of the things that we're talking about. So they'll answer differently than they actually feel because they don't want people to know that that's like really what's going on. There's also fear that this information that you're collecting will come out and someone will identify your feelings to your person and that will get you in trouble. And so there's a lot of different things. So there's a robust science behind measuring human emotions, though. It's called psychometrics. It's a science that's been around for almost a millennia, probably a millennia. I know that I found out, ironically, when I was in my PhD program focusing on psychometrics, that my grandfather established one of the earliest psychometrics labs for the U.S. government. And so I don't know what the nature nurture in that side is since I never met him, but it's kind of one of those things where there is science behind it. And it uses a lot of robust statistics to check reliability, validity, all these things to make sure that we're measuring what we think we're measuring, and that we're doing it accurately over time. And so we can measure it, but there's so many challenges to getting there. There's so much disbelief in the information that people will just completely disregard an entire study because it's not math or science. It's not a computer that is just, 2 + 2 = 4. It makes it challenging and just in general to try and do this stuff. And then there's all the things that you mentioned just in terms of, can we actually do this? Can we measure this correctly? And that get in the way.
And so where I'm heading with this is back towards how we first started talking, which is resilience. And we'll come back to that in a second. We'll get to it in a second. But I wonder that I'm just wondering about people who use terms like burnout, stress, overwhelm, these anxiety. These feel like words that have become part of the common lexicon. They're sort of easily used by people, but aren't easily defined, and so are easily misused by people. And that then gives power to someone who wants to dismiss it all as kind of hokum, that they're going, well, you don't really know, you don't mean that. What you mean is you're tired, or you're a little bit exhausted, but you're not. So people are using the words slightly ambiguously, which doesn't help. Is there some truth in that, or does it not matter? Does it not matter if at least we're using the words and trying to talk about it?
So from my perspective, which is going to be driven by like rigor and science, when we're using those words, we should have the correct measure for it. So there is a burnout inventory that measures burnout. It's the Maslach burnout inventory. I'm looking it up right now because I can't remember. There's aspects of burnout that define the construct. So like construct, that's a word that a lot of people don't use, but it's a latent variable. I'm using all these stats terms. I got to find a better word. But there are certain things that you're trying to measure. So burnout is a construct. And when you're doing that, you need to have your definition. And if we're not working on and off of a common definition, that is a fair criticism of someone claiming burnout. Because these things are defined. They are measured by certain things that.
So is the challenge to help people understand what those things really mean? Because I don't criticize someone generally for using, if they feel they might be burnt out from what they understand, I wouldn't stop them saying they feel burnt out, even if they couldn't then, I then go, right, here's the test. Nicole says, define burnout, and they get it wrong. So that's the sort of complicated area in the middle of this, isn't it? So maybe our job, my job, is to help communicate that the precision around these definitions, so that people don't. This is Brené Brown's 87 words for emotions, isn't it? The more words we have, the better. So, okay, so people don't know how to define burnout precisely. Is it still okay if they're using the word generally or not? For example, we're talking about burnout. It could be, all the other words we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the difference between like a scientific study and a personal experience. I would never say, if you're feeling burnt out, you're probably burnt out. And if you took the measure, you'd probably get a high score on it. Because burnout it's exhaustion, it's emotional exhaustion that's related to the workplace. There's actually studies that have shown that burnout is no different than depression, which I think is a really scary thing that we should be talking about more, because a depressed workforce is not an effective workforce. And there's an 87%, it's 0.887 correlation between the two things. That's almost 90% correlation, which when you're talking about what a measurement of a construct like that, that means that they're not different. You can't claim that those are two different things when the correlation is so high. And so, yeah, but these are scientific studies. I was like, in a scientific study, I would want you to define your construct, measure it correctly. If you're claiming that there are relationships between something, you better have those well defined so that you know what you're talking about. But burnout has become such a phenomenon, I think, because of the things you're seeing in your emotional overdraft research as well, where people are giving too much of themselves to the workplace. And so I wouldn't fault a person or tell them that they shouldn't feel burnt out or say that they're not burnt out. I would if it was in a paper, though. I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we want is, words are so important, aren't they? Because they also make us feel. If we identify with the term burnt out, then we can start to live to it, and we start to behave differently, and so on. So, but it's just so important that we start to use the right words. And because you've already mentioned exhaustion and depression, there's a lot of, in this space, there are a lot of words. And I've heard people say, well, I felt burnt out on Friday and had a good sleep over the weekend, and now I feel better. Well, that's not burnout. That's tiredness. It might be a latent level of stress. There's something else going on. But I also wouldn't jump all over them and say, you haven't defined it properly. I try and understand what they're doing with it. So I think this is so useful, and this might be, maybe we're nitpicking or dancing on a pinhead here, but I hope people listening understand why, because it's the reason I invented the term emotional overdraft was because there wasn't a word for this collection of behaviors, this subsidizing success at your own mental or physical, at the cost of your own mental or physical well-being. So again, I've just added another word to the mix, I suppose, or another label. And I don't mind that much if people don't understand it exactly, but I do want people to understand that might be it. And if they do recognize it, then they might be able to it might give them pause, and they might do something differently, I suppose. So that's, I'm thinking about someone I interviewed called Paul O'Malley, and he was it goes back to the body keeps the score, I think. And Paul was really, really exhausted and was medically assessed as suffering from a deep level of anxiety and depression, and was behaving like that, self-medicating with alcohol and all sorts of things. But he just refused to accept it. The business was doing well. He was leading this new division in New York. He was taking on staff. Everyone was doing great, the business, and his body was giving way, but his brain could not accept that this was what was going on. So it's so important we find these words. Yeah, that's why I go on about it. Sorry, dear listener, but that's what we do. So where Nicole and I actually bumped into each other was when we were talking about resilience, and I talk about the currency of an emotional overdraft being resilience, and maybe a better word, although I can't rewrite 3,000 copies that have gone out so far, but maybe I could have used a better word than resilience. But you have a very firm opinion on resilience, don't you? Do you want to tell me about it?
Yeah. And I'll start with resilience is a wonderful and beautiful thing. I don't think you used the wrong word. When you're able to rebound from an extraordinarily stressful situation and be resilient, I think that's the beauty of some of the most inspiring human behavior. It comes from resilience. And I think resilience has been turned into a weapon against the individual. We're blaming individuals for systemic problems that resilience can't fix. And resilience is not something that's reserved for everyday interactions. The majority of people are not resilient. I don't know the exact numbers, but it was around 30% of people are highly resilient. There's
Similar to a number I've
like
heard, actually.
5%, right? But it was approximately 30% of people are highly resilient. That means that 70% of people aren't. And so we can't just rely on resilience to get people through things, because when you have systemic problems that are creating a situation where your workforce is required to be resilient, that's not the point of the construct. It's meant for extraordinary situations. It's meant for highly stressful, sometimes traumatizing situations where you rebound and come back from it stronger. When we start to apply resilience to like, oh, your job is really hard every day because you have chaos and every interaction. Your work scope is constantly changing. You have no idea what's going to come at you any day. Like your work could be completely interrupted by something that's going to make all the deliverables that you thought you were going to get done moot. And you don't know when to expect that. That shouldn't require resilience. Like to me, I'm like, you need a project manager. So I there's a quote, and I'm going to get the quote wrong again, but it's someone went out and said, like, I never want to be called resilient again. Like, give me peace, give me love. I want to be held. Do not make me be resilient is the idea behind it. And that is where like, I feel that I've been called resilient my entire life. I would rather like not be taking punches that I have to then recover from and be strong. I would have rather none of that stuff happen to me. Instead, I would have just rather have been allowed to be strong without all of this hardship in front of me. And so I don't love the term resilience, but it's not because it's a great concept. It's just hard for me when it's applied to systems that people are like, oh, just be resilient.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I totally with you. And my point about the currency is that we were talking about the difficulty in measuring things, and your emotional overdraft is very difficult to measure because it's a feeling. It's a how you responded to that event, day, week, month, whatever you're dealing with. But whatever your level of resilience, not being resilient, but your resilience, it is eroded if you are trading, if you are subsidizing the success of your business or your organization or your life at your own physical or mental cost. It is being degraded. Your ability to bounce back, whatever level it starts at, whatever level it finishes at, it is being degraded. And that's how I see it, is that the longer you're in your overdraft, and we were talking just before we started recording about the term overdraft, and it's not. I mean, it's exclusively used here in the UK as a financial. It's a banking overdraft thing, which I think is in States as well, isn't it? Yeah. So, and my point is, it's you can dip into your overdraft. You can dip into that inner strength and find the ability to pull an all-nighter, or to deal with change, or to deal with something thoroughly unexpected or difficult, or balancing stress at home with having to deliver something at work for a while, if you have to. But what you can't do, what most people can't do, without some consequences, deal with that on and on and on and on without repaying it. And you said earlier on, it's okay to dip into that, but you've got to come back. And that's the key. So I suppose I'm not lauding resilience, and I've read quite a lot about it, and I agree. I think this idea of you need to be resilient, it's a nonsense in a way to say that. It doesn't make sense. I vividly remember going to a sports day when my kids were little, and there was a very wealthy, and I knew who she was, and their family owned a media empire, so they were very wealthy. And this lady sat at the front, and her poor little kid was running in like a 4-year-old's race, like tiny children. And this kid was way at the back. And this woman just bellowed, "Run faster," at the child. And I thought, well, short of wanting to go and shout at her, which of course I didn't do, I just thought, in what world would you think that was? The kid's doing what she can. The kid is doing what she can. Support her. Don't just bellow, "Run faster," which is not helpful advice. And I suppose that's really saying be resilient. Be more resilient is nonsensical. I run a bit, and I've recently done a half marathon. I can do it in about 2 hours. But if my wife just said to me, "Well, Andy, run faster. If you want to do an hour and a half, run faster," I can't. There's the speed at which this body moves. So I sort of ambled off there a little bit. Sorry, Nicole. But it's that idea of resilience being something where you just have some more. Do some more resilience is a curious idea.
Yeah. And when I was in my graduate program, one of my team members on my research group, they did a study on resilience, and they found a bunch of things that help predict resilience. So things like running, for example. So healthy eating, getting good sleep, being able to exercise daily. Those are all extremely privileged activities. And the things that even help you become more resilient, you want to tell a single mom who's working 2 jobs to pay for her children to be able to eat, to go, eat healthier, like figure out how to buy healthy food here. Because in the States, healthy food is expensive. And also, like, find a time to exercise in between your 2 jobs that you're already working. Make sure that you're sleeping in the free time that you have between those 16 hours you work every day. Like, it's some people don't have the opportunity to do the things that can even help you become more resilient. And so even keeping that in mind, that like resilience can be a concept of the privileged, because everyone has the privilege of having systems and situations that allow them to be resilient.
When you were saying that, I was wondering, we live in the reality we create for ourselves. Whatever the situation, our brain creates the story we live. And I know when I say that, sometimes people go, "Andy, you've gone a bit woo-woo," but there's lots and lots and lots of evidence to prove that's the case. And clearly, we create our own reality. I wonder if the answer isn't to that person working 16 hours, 2 jobs, to say, find some time to have a jog. But I wonder what we could do to help those people with understanding how they experience the stress and the pressure of having those 2 jobs and not seeing the kids as much as they want to, and worrying that they're not there for them, and whether they can feed them or not. And I wonder if there is something we could do in those circumstances. And that's the example you brought to the table. But I think then if there is, we could take that and apply that to anybody. Is there something, is it educational, or is it just being more understanding or less judgmental? Is there something we can do? I mean, it's a
Like raise the
tiny
minimum
question,
wage.
Nicole.
No, pay people a living wage. I mean, that's too simple. And that's such a pie in the sky. You'd have to change so much to get that done. Um, that's a really good question. There, I mean, of course, there are things that you can say. So, like, if someone can't exercise, like, walk, go, like on your break at work and grab a snack and go for a walk. Can you take a call and walk? Those sorts of things where you can incorporate the things that build resilience into your day and have it not be so difficult. And I'm thinking,
It's a very unfair question of me because
yeah, it's a hard
it's
question. It's a good question.
it was prompted by your thought, and I thought, well, okay, I get it, and I absolutely understand the privilege. You know, I go to our local supermarket here, and all humanity is in our supermarket, and I know that me sticking organic bananas and is not, if they're going to buy fruit at all, some people are not buying organic bananas. I know that, and I'm only buy English apples in season. Why would you buy French apples? Well, because they're bloody cheaper, Andy. That's why. And some people don't have the choice. But I think let's park it. But I think there's something there to explore, and that's what I love about this podcast. I get to talk to really clever people who pose questions as much as posing answers or presenting answers, and that's good too.
Yeah.
That's
Well, and
great.
before we move on, the answer to me is you change the systems. There's a study that I'm thinking of that is why I say we need to change the systems. They tested resilience on it was a group of Black men, and they did it. It was a longitudinal study from childhood through adulthood. And what they found is that the participants who were higher in resilience as they were younger and as they grew older ended up with more like physical health consequences than the group who wasn't resilient. And so and I'll say regularly, like, resilience can be a trauma response. It looks like avoidance also looks like resilience. And when you use avoidance, so everything's fine. We don't need to talk about it. These are great. Things are great. I'm resilient. I'm totally fine. This has been hard, but I'm okay. That's an avoidance tactic. And that your body keeps the score on that, if you will, from that. And so, like, when I think about these things in terms of how do you change it? Because I was like, you could make someone more resilient, but then they're going to have a heart attack earlier than someone who wasn't, and we don't want those consequences too. And so it still just goes back to, like, we need to change these systems that are creating situations where people have their only choice is resilience.
And I think that's the answer. That is, there's no simple way to do that, but that's correct. And the reason I'm thinking this is relevant to our listeners is because most people are running up an emotional overdraft because of the 10 drivers that I've identified in the research, which are basically behaviors or habits. We could call them habits. And so changing the habits, it doesn't require you to read another book or learn a new technique or do something like that. It does require you to try and change a habit. And that's why I call it simple. It's not easy. The editors wanted to call it 10 easy ways to, and I said, there's nothing easy about this. Changing habits, changing behavior is the hardest thing to do. And that's why all the amazing books about habit, which I'd recommend anyone to read. And by the way, whilst I'm thinking about it, follow Nicole on LinkedIn. It's well worth listening to what she has to say on a regular basis. So do that. But the habit books exist, and I think people are drawn to them because we understand that if we could just find the secret to changing habits, then we unlock a lot of things. And that's maybe what I was getting at with those parents who are working two jobs. There's going to be some habitual behavior that's not helpful in there as well, which is learned through experience, but isn't necessarily helpful now. And that's the same thing with my audience and with people in work and leaders and any of us really, is that I look to, yes, of course, get healthier habits. But most people know that we should eat better. Most people know they should do more exercise. Most people know that they should hire well. Most people know they should delegate. There's nothing in the last 10 chapters of my book that will be new news to anybody. but it's about how do you start to break old habits and start making new habits. Is it James Clear that wrote Atomic Habits? I think it might have been, but
I was like, the one
I
that
always confuse it with Tiny Habits.
there's the Power of Habit, which
Yeah.
I own but have never read.
Yeah. But there was one that's talking about flossing. And this is the habit of flossing and how you get into the habit of flossing. And I love the idea and it's basically you break it down into lots of little tiny steps. So you always get the floss out, even if you don't use it. And then you always just floss one tooth and so on. And my publisher has run every day. I think it must be nearly for 7 years now. She's run every day, wherever she is, however she feels. And she said it changed when she put her running shoes by the front door. For her, that's how and then she defined a run as a minimum of 2 kilometers. So it's not, a 10K, or it's not 8 miles. It's a minimum of 2. And sometimes she'll do a K out and a K back, half a mile and half a mile. And but every day for nearly 7 years. And that's how you make habits. And I think I'd encourage people to think about habit and how habits is really an interesting area to study, because you start to understand yourself. We are just a big bag of habits generally, because they're shortcuts to getting things done in most cases, or to dealing with trauma and the sort of stuff that Nicole's been talking about.
And I think that an important piece as you're trying to change your habits, there's this change model. It's called the Prochaska and DiClemente model, and it relates to it's a study that was done on I think alcoholics, but it's addiction behavior. But we use it in the workplace all the time this is how people change. And one of the steps in there is relapse, and the authors make a point to talk about how important it is to have social support when you relapse. And we can apply that to habit. Because if you're trying to establish a habit, the worst thing you can do is shame yourself for not doing it. And so from a trauma-informed perspective, I'll say, as you're trying to develop those new habits, also give yourself grace, because they're very hard to set up. And if you don't have the grace for yourself, you're less likely to eventually turn those into habits.
And I'm going to share something a bit personal here with you. I struggle with my weight forever, and my view of my weight, actually, probably more than my weight. And I definitely have been someone who would eat sweets and biscuits, particularly biscuits. And my cookies, you call them in America, but they're actually called biscuits.
I was like, I love biscuits. We call them, yes, biscuits come with gravy. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. But no, they're scones, I think. But anyway, cookie biscuits. And I've been married a very long time, and I have many times hidden them from my wife, and then hidden the packaging in the bin so she doesn't find it. And that's not helpful. That's not helpful to me. It's not, because like you say, shame then comes and joins the game as well, and makes it a lot worse. So I mean, be kind to yourself. The reason I shared that is because people listening, it's really hard. And I talk about habits all the time and changing habits. It's really damn hard. And in the book, I do say, there's quite nice techniques for if you fall off the wagon, about having a note ready for yourself, because it's going to happen. Have a note ready to support yourself and forgive yourself, and having other people support you and so on. I think it's a great idea. But the stuff we're talking about here is about trying to change habit. So you can reduce your emotional overdraft significantly by behaving differently. And that's what Nicole and I are both saying, and coming to it from different directions, I think, but it's what we're both saying. And I've spoken way too much, by the way. I'm so sorry, because we've got Dr Nicole DeKay, PhD on our thing, and I've been talking, but I think we've come to, I think we've covered something really important here, and we've given enough. There's enough here for people to chew on. But we always finish with a slightly simple question, which is, or a sort of a lighter question, which is 10 simple changes is the idea of the book. But do you have a simple change you could share with us?
Yeah, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Movement is really critical to releasing stress. And so if people could make one change to calm themselves down in the midst of stress, it would be movement. So doing somatic things like going for a walk, stretching, really sinking into your body and like being able to move it so you release some of that stress that you're carrying and holding. When we don't move, it just builds up and these toxins build up in your body. And so to me, like a walk, go for a walk. Like I said earlier, go for a walk. If you can go for a 5-minute walk every day, the impact it will have, like the mind body connection is there. And that walk, I'm speaking from experience. I'm a little bit sad. I just had a baby. And so I was working out of, we have a property about 5 doors down, and I kept my office there. And so I was walking every day to go to the bathroom because my office didn't have a bathroom. And so it was 3 minutes there and 3 minutes back. And my health and my well-being improved so much while I was doing that. And lamenting that I don't have that. I'm breastfeeding, and so I need to be close to the baby all the time now. And so I don't get to go to my old office anymore. We've actually emptied it out completely, and it's going to be storage. And so if I could recommend people do one thing, it's move. It doesn't have to be walking. It could be stretching at your desk, but get your body moving because it's so critical to reducing stress. And when you get into emotional overdraft, stress is going to follow. So yeah, try to move.
Fantastic, simple, something to work on. Nicole, that's brilliant. There's so many other things I'd like to ask you. Maybe we'll get the chance to talk again. I'd love it if we could. But thank you so much. Right, last thing I should say, if people want to find you, where would they go to find what you're doing? Because I know you've got some things to talk about.
Yeah, so LinkedIn is one place. You've already mentioned that. You can also go to my website, which is humanalists.com. And hopefully that will be linked so you can spell it correctly. And you can sign up for newsletters there, sign up to be a part of our community for workplace democratization of data. And I think, yeah, those are the 2 places that I would recommend. I have an Instagram account, but I rarely check it. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
LinkedIn and humanalists.com. We'll put the links in the show notes. Absolutely, we will. And the name of the study you mentioned as well. I think that's going to be interesting for people. Lots of other things. We'll pick it all out. Nicole, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to chat.
I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the conversation with Nicole. Just listen to smart people talk all day long. I also appreciate I interrupted her a lot, but it was sort of drawn out of me, and I felt the need. So apologies if I rabbited on too much. And I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something from it. It was interesting and engaging. She was a very engaging guest. But also some important things I think came up in there. What can we take away from this? So what's the point of me adding a few more words at the end of this thing? I think definitely my first thought is around resilience, which is where Nicole and I started our discussion months and months ago. And that idea that resilience isn't something that you can ask people to have. We either are or aren't, or we are more or less. You can't make people more resilient necessarily, although you can start to, but it may not be within their gift to become more resilient. And her idea about the parent working 2 jobs and 16 hours and so on, we can easily take that and explore that in work and in leadership and in our own businesses and think, how can we apply that same logic to how we think about other people, and particularly how we think about ourselves as well, and be curious and explore and bring some kindness and generosity to our thinking as well. I think that feels important to me here. So that was my first thought. And the second one was a little less obvious, but we spoke about it quite a lot, so maybe it was only less obvious to me, was the idea of defining terms and using language. And I think if you're feeling you have an emotional overdraft, or you think you know someone who you see running an emotional overdraft, it's important to try and find the right words to describe how you're feeling, and to try and find the right words to describe what you're dealing with, because any level of precision there gives you two things. One, it allows you to communicate it better. So if you are in stress, stressed, and you feel tired, and perhaps towards exhaustion or towards overwhelm or burnout, then understanding those words allows you to communicate that better. And the better you can communicate that, the more chance you have of getting help. And then I also think if we misuse those terms and we feel, well, I feel like I'm burning out, you may well be, and I'm not saying it for a second that you're not, but we can start to respond to that feeling as if it was real, because that's how we operate, and we can start to treat ourselves as if that is actually the case, and it may not be. It might be extreme tiredness, it might be exhaustion, it might be it could be, or it could be burnout, or it could be depression. But the idea of finding that for yourself and then responding to that is dangerous. So I think that's something to ponder on as well, is to recognize when you're in a state of emotional overdraft, recognize when it's building and becoming more for you and not going back down and you're not managing to reduce it. Recognize it and use that pause and that recognition as an opportunity to do something else, or to do something differently. And that could be, often that is, to seek help. It doesn't have to be medical help. It can be talking to a friend, talking to your partner, talking to someone like me. If you want to, drop me a note and I'll try and reply. But taking a pause, and often that's enough to just slightly reset. It's almost a kind of off and on again type of solution. So be kind to yourself, but also don't categorize yourself too quickly. Really understand where you are and what's going on with yourself. There's so much more to take out of it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Listen to it again if you need to. I think these things almost always bear a second listen. But I hope it was useful. If it was, please subscribe, please like it, please tell your friends, and may your emotional overdraft always be tiny.